Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
We have Rosina here. I'm so glad Rosina and her sister Wahida are able to be with us. They belong to the Sufi Foundation UK, and Sufis are great people, and especially in our diocesan interfaith work, they have been great supporters since the time of Father Dennis Hall. And the last talk we had was by Father Adrian Graffey on Nostra Aetate, and she was one of the respondents. She gave her response in poetry, and how wonderful today she's also responded while having listened to Father John. She's written a short poetry, and Father Adrian has been kind enough to ask her to read. So may I welcome Rosina here, please.
Okay, so my name's Rosina Iqbal, and I'm a part of Azimia Sufi Order. And the poem is Azimia Sufi Order. So the poem starts with the land. Before the walls, before the flags, before the names that history gave, there was only earth, breathed into being by the one who owned it. Kings arrived, kingdoms fell, empires carved borders upon dust that remembered none of them. The prophets did not ask, who is the strongest? They asked, who walked with justice? The wilderness was never empty. It was a classroom where pride became hunger, hunger became trust, and trust became worship. Every promise carried a condition. Every blessing carried a responsibility. Every inheritance carried a warning. Do not say, my own hands has won this. The land remembers. Every prayer, every tear, every exile, every child. For the earth has never belonged to those who grasp it, but to the one who fashioned it from nothing. We arrive as strangers, we depart as strangers. Only God remains. And the ground beneath our feet still whispers the same internal truth. Justice is holier than possession. Mercy is stronger than conquest. Truth is greater than power, and every path home begins with humanity before God. So as a Muslim, I believe the Holy Land is blessed because of the many prophets who lived there, and we hold Jerusalem in high regard. The Quran speaks of the Holy Land in the time of Prophet Moses, but it doesn't go into details about modern political borders or permanent ownership. For me, the most important teaching is that God commands justice, mercy, and compassion. So my concern is for the dignity and well-being of everyone who lives there, Muslims, Christians, and Jewish alike. I think our shared responsibility is to seek peace, justice, and understanding. Just want to finish off with saying, as a Muslim, I also find it deeply meaningful that for centuries the keys of the Church of the Holy Church in Jerusalem has been entrusted to Muslim families. It is a reminder that this holy city has a strong history of shared guardianship and mutual trust between faith communities. To me, this reflects the value that all our faith calls us towards: respect, responsibility, and peace coexistence. Thank you very much.
Right, now we're going to look at some difficult texts. There are texts such as chapter 7, 1-4 in Deuteronomy, which suggests that God commands extreme hostility to people who are already in the land, even to the point of extermination. And this raises the question as to whether God not only approves of genocide, but even commands it. Now, in this particular text, what is quite interesting is that you go directly from show them no mercy to do not intermarry with them. Well, of course, if they're all dead, how will there be intermarriage? That would call God's command into question. So the question is then, what's going on? Were there 2 points of view in being brought together in this chapter, or what? It must be possible that the 7 nations that were mentioned were no longer to be seen when that tradition began. But then the editor adds another point of view, that there's to be no intermarriage with any of the indigenous people, which was still being taken very seriously, and in some way was considered to be a matter of life and death. And of course we have a similar kind of expression in the gospel. If your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. We can ask, quite rightly, is Jesus really proposing self-mutilation? Or is he using hyperbole to emphasize the danger that lustful looking, for example, might lead to? We also find contradictory texts that suggest the very opposite of genocide. And by the way, I'm using genocide now in a very loose sort of way. It's a word that only started to come into use from the United Nations after the Holocaust. It's a very modern, very modern term. And so what's going on in the Bible is not exactly that either. There's just not enough evidence for to say that. But it's a useful umbrella term for the moment. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, Moses recalls the incident of the golden calf. And remember, while Moses was away talking to God, the people all were feeling that they were getting nowhere. They were losing faith in God and in Moses, and so they built a golden calf, and they worship that. And Moses discovers this is happening. And so he breaks the 2 tablets of the law that he'd brought down from Sinai, as if to say, oh, that's it, I've had enough, you've had enough. But then God orders replacements, because God doesn't have the heart to destroy his people. And in the speech that follows, Moses tells the people that God requires them to love the strangers, providing them with food and clothing. Why, he said, why should you do this? Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So as you were in the land of Egypt, you treat those who are in the land of Egypt now right in your own territory. So God's love is never exclusive to Israel. And God is always on the side of the orphan, the widow, the stranger. In other words, to those who are marginal to the concerns of earthly powers. So Israel's vocation is not to be the exclusive political choice of God, but to the witness to the inclusive orientation that's demanded by his love. And this inclusivity extends even to the use of the produce of the land. So people are told they must give a tithe of their produce every 3 years, for the benefit not just of the Levites, who by tradition had no land of their own, but any resident aliens, along with widows and orphans, so that they may eat their fill within your towns. Nor are grain producers or olive growers to be mean about any leftovers. These must be left for the stranger, the resident alien, the widow, and the orphan. So again there we see this dynamic ecology I talked about earlier between God, the land, and the morality that's required of God's people. Now just to give you another complexity, we look at the comparison between Joshua and the book of Judges. Now Joshua is representative of what's often called the conquest model. How did the Israelites get into the land? Well, they got into the land because they conquered it under Joshua. So I think that behind all this is a sense that many people must have had. It's a miracle we are here at all. And then, of course, once you say that, somebody's going to say, well, how did it all happen? And if you're a small state and you've got some very big bigger states around you, and they've got the latest technology. There's that wonderful line in the Psalms that used to always amuse me when I was a student. A vain hope of safety is the horse, despite its power, it cannot save. And I was thinking to myself, horses saving? What's this all about? But actually it makes sense when you see horses as part of the new warfare, the new thing, and the advantage that the cavalry give you. So that's what you've got there. So this these different memories are highlighted when you compare the books of Joshua and Judges. In very broad terms, the memories in the book of Joshua are defined in terms of conquest, a conquest that is ordered by the Lord, and that the people seem to be very happy to obey. So you hear a quote, for example, like from Joshua: by God, be strong and very courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give to them. So conquest in this context seems to be divinely commanded, and conquest is what happens. But the conquest then has to be nuanced. Before leading the people across the Jordan, Joshua sends over 2 spies. And when they return, they say to Joshua, "Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us." Now at that stage, not an armed warrior has crossed the boundaries. Not a blow has been struck. So there's a lot of hyperbole going on there, or is it a bit? You could say, is it a bit like when the hotel of immigrants suddenly, or a hotel in a village is filled with immigrants, and you think, my goodness me, we're being swamped by all this. So you got to think about we won't be able to prove those necessarily that is the case, but it does give us food for thought. And that's partly why the Word of God is there, to make us think about things too. So what we actually see, though, in Joshua when we read the text, is that for the most part, they're battles without fighting. The language of the conquest echoes the propaganda used by the great imperial rulers, the kings of Egypt, Assyria and Babylon, to justify their rule. So in the case of these outside rulers, the king conquers because his gods are behind him. But interestingly, in Joshua, the victories come through direct divine intervention. The combatants don't have to actually lift a finger in order to conquer the people. And yet the victories somehow are always total. Enemies are destroyed, no survivors are left. So the big difference is that in the biblical stories, it's not the king or the emperor who is the main actor, it's God himself. And that's why in the story of the conquest of Jericho, you have this scenario which almost looks like a liturgical ceremony, like a procession, because you've got people blowing trumpets, you've got priests processing 7 times round the walls of the city, and then on the 7th time, or whatever it is, suddenly the walls all came tumbling down. By the time the earliest memories that contributed to the biblical stories were written down, many of these conquered cities and peoples no longer existed anyway. So that would give a kind of credibility, historical credibility, to stories of this kind, whose primary purpose was to confirm that their presence in the land, like their survival in the desert, was solely down to the Lord. In other words, it was an act of grace. And the conquest stories too would be emphasized by those who wish to stress the holiness of the land and the need for the people to have a clearly distinct identity if they were to be faithful to the covenant that was made with the Lord. So if the peoples found there were driven out, in a sense they could not be a threat to their faith. So it's no wonder that traditions grew up which put into great detail and great hyperbole that how did we get here? We got here because Joshua led us and conquered the land, and God sanctioned all that. So, and of course, if the peoples are driven out, then they can't be a threat. They can't be a threat to the faith. Yet even so, amid the voices remembering Israel's place in the land as conquest, even if that was wishful thinking, there were other voices going on as well whose memory varied, and which, rather like if you compare the biblical story to a wall that's been papered over, if the decorator doesn't do a good job, then all the cracks start to appear again. And that's what, in a sense, the Bible is like that. There's all sorts of cracks in the story, in the narrative. And if with a bit of careful analysis, you can suddenly begin to discover the cracks. The problem is that when you do that all the time for a living, you discover nothing but cracks, and then you've got to try and put it all together again, which is a little bit can be a little bit difficult. So in the story of the invasion of Jericho, strangely enough, the heroine of the story turns out to be a Canaanite woman, again one of the enemy, and she hid the spies, and she facilitated their escape from the king of Jericho. And then she professed her belief in the God of Israel and asks for the safety of her family in exchange for her help. So the conquering people duly give her a sign to put in her window to save her when they come into the land. And it happens to be a red cord or a red ribbon or something like that. Now, of course, immediately that story, you begin to think, where have I heard something like that before? And of course, it's back to the Exodus story, and how the blood of the lambs was sprinkled on the lintels of the slaves' houses in order to protect them from the exterminating angel that was going in the direction of Pharaoh. And again, of course, there you've got a story. Well, not all the Canaanites were put to death. Ruth remains, and of course, where does Ruth's name appear? In the infancy narrative. That's the only time I'm going to refer to the New Testament in the story. Now, in the book of Judges, you've got a different scenario entirely. And it's more a scenario of gradual assimilation of people into the land. I think somebody was asking me a question about that. How this actually happened is probably much more difficult to do, and we probably need another talk to look at that. So the book of Judges sees the presence in the land as the result of assimilation with the people already there, and that inevitably produces a compromise in their faith. So the book of Judges in chapter 3 says the Israelites lived among the Canaanites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So going back to that Deuteronomy piece, you remember we said that it said, right, exterminate them all, and then it says don't intermarry with them. So you can see where what's happening is that the author, in the back of his mind, it's what's really going on is intermarriage. Don't intermarry with them. So that even gets inserted into the historical text and almost becomes part of the original deal, if you like, even though it's completely illogical that would happen. So and it's not actually the cultural mixing in itself that's the problem. The problem is idolatry, because the nations are not practicing the values that Israel learned in the wilderness, and Israel itself will soon not be practicing the values. So clearly too, the bigger picture in Judges is one in which the Israelites are in the land, but they haven't actually conquered the land. That's not to say that they wouldn't like to conquer the land, and it's not to say that they're not being attacked and plundered by peoples that are already there, and that they feel that there is no God to help them. So what happens in the book of Judges is that the Israelites lurch from one crisis to another. And they're temporarily rescued by what I call amateur or charismatic leaders, known as judges, who rescue them until the next crisis befalls them. So my own reading of this contrast between Joshua and Judges would be that within ancient Israel, there were two different responses to the miracle that was Israel's existence in its land at all. And of course, the word, if you listen to what's going on in Israel, the word existential crops up more than once. It's frequently used by people defending the status quo there. So one of the memories was that they must have eliminated their enemies, and the other was that they were assimilated. Now I know, as somebody of a certain age, which I won't disclose, that I remember back to the time when I was studying with Father Adrian here, and now and again, I know you were a much more honest scholar than I was, but I'd occasionally get round an examiner and try and get my way, And I could tell this story in great detail about the wonderful, the wonderful way that I kitted the examiner into something or other, and do it. And there's something similar going on in the biblical stories. That's what they're doing. And as the country gets used to where it is, you look at the, if you like, history becomes romanticized as well. So I think the latter is that the assimilation model is the more likely one of the two. Now, there was a time under King Solomon when the state expanded, the boundaries of the state expanded to as far as they were ever going to get. But the two kingdoms still lived precariously, and they also had to take into account that Assyria was round the corner. So there was always there was probably this sense of, yes, we like Solomon, we got in by conquest too. Solomon has got new land by conquering it, but well, thank God we're here in the land. We're alive today. Next week, who knows? So I think the idea of conquest as such was probably wishful thinking, but it's a useful means of exalting one's God over the deities of the surrounding neighbours. It's not historical writing, it's preaching, basically. So we move on now to the monarchy. Under the kings, the covenant of God with Moses that he made on Mount Sinai, which is a very important part of the book of Exodus and the part of Deuteronomy, it's not annulled, but it's dominated by another covenant. And that was the promise that was given to King David that his dynasty would last forever. Now, what happens, though, under the kings? Well, land in practice ceases to be a gift, and it becomes an object to be controlled and managed. Land becomes the object of the earthly powers, and it becomes the fruit of their labours, so to speak. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I spoke about God, land, and people forming part of one ecology. Well, by this stage, if the ecology is not broken, it's severely tested during the reign of the kings. So, in practice, if not in theory, God is marginalised, and the king acts as if the values of the wilderness no longer exist. They only exist in the memories of the prophets who attempt to call back the kings with threats of judgment, tempered by promises of mercy. So you have Hosea, for example, in a work of imagination. He's addressing the northern kingdom that's still in existence at this stage, and he sees the corruption and the idolatry of the northern kingdom are so deep-rooted that only exile, only a return to the wilderness, can bring about a restoration of the covenant relationship with God and rekindle the love of old. Incidentally, have I mentioned the monarchy? We're still on the monarchy. Yeah, there's a mention there. No, sorry, move back onto the prophets again. Yeah, you can move back onto the prophets. Sorry. You see, there's a reference there to Achor, which probably is a bit strange to you. Acco was the place where a man called Achan and his family were executed because they were involved in a war, and God had commanded them that they were not to. They were only to kill the people, not to actually take any spoils or booty from the war at all. That was to be consecrated to God, and so Hosea sees it as a place of punishment, but it's also, in his vision, it's also a place of repentance. So that's why that's there. Jeremiah, on the other hand, sees the wilderness as the place of the young bride, Israel as the young bride who showed love for her husband. So it's a place of fidelity, trust, and humility, as opposed to the corruption of Jerusalem in his own time. In Jerusalem, of course, the inhabitants, they were obviously great worshippers, so they've got great faith in the temple. They say the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, as if there's no tomorrow. But actually what's happening is that their religious life is superficially wonderful, but actually it's really basically corrupt. So exile finally becomes a reality. And Jeremiah writes from Judah a letter to the royal family and the leading members of the people who were deported to Babylon. And he implies that their relationship with God can be restored even though they are no longer in the land. So the thrust of his letter is that they should come to terms with what happened, settle in Babylon, build homes, eat what the land offers, and then at the end he says, and pray for the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Interesting quote, interesting way. Now, Jeremiah doesn't make a direct link between exile and wilderness, but we can detect that there is some connection there. Now, on the one hand, Jeremiah envisages that the exile will be permanent. So sometimes he just says to people, look, wake up and taste the coffee sort of thing, this is not going to end. But then on the other hand, he promises restoration after 70 years, comparable with the wilderness leading to the promised land. But both the wilderness and exile are going to be means of testing Israel's faith, and both call for renewal of heart. So I want to finish by talking about Abraham. Now, some of you might have thought, hang on, the story doesn't begin in Exodus. It doesn't begin with the liberation. What about Abraham? You haven't mentioned a word about Abraham. Well, there was a reason for that. When the Bible is finally put together, of course, Abraham becomes the first major character in the biblical story. And the story of Abraham, if you remember, was preceded by a number of myths. There was the Garden of Eden, and Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel that the Pope has recently talked about. And all those, we could talk for an hour again on those myths. But the thing about them is they're again like a mirror. We look at those and we see the human race in them. So it's only with the exile that the figure of Abraham becomes so important that he becomes a new theological anchor, if you like, in the bigger story. If you look through the rest of the Old Testament, there's references to the ancestors of Israel and so on, but Abraham doesn't get an awful lot of time. He doesn't get a lot of cover, as they'd say. He's just an ancestor. His name is there, but that's about it. It's only in the book of Nehemiah, which recounts the return of the exiles, that Abraham suddenly becomes a dominant figure in the story. And of course, it's around this time too that the book of Genesis is put together. In the context of worship, in the book of Nehemiah, the priest who is associated with him, whose name, not the priest, he's a scribe. Scribe, he's not a priest. Mistake. He recites a prayer which begins with God's creation, and he associates Abraham's calling with the creation itself. And he associates them also with God's covenant with Abraham, which is motivated by his faith and trust in God. Now, God's covenant with Abraham then is included, of course, the promise of the land. That was one of the things. There was also the great name and the great descendants that he would have. So how all that will be played, how that promise will be played out, of course, is the major topic in the book of Genesis. Now, interestingly, Moses is named in the prayer as a servant of God. But there's no mention in the prayer of the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai. And no mention is made much of Moses there. Moses is mentioned, but his role is minimized in it. And if you remember, when we talked about there was the covenant at Sinai, there was the king's covenant. Now we have this covenant with Abraham that comes into the picture, and it's almost as if we can only deal with one covenant at a time. So this one now takes center stage. So what will happen when we read the book of Genesis? If we read it out of this background of exile, what we're seeing, I think, is Abraham being presented as a model for living in the land. And of course, so what will be interesting, though, about the Genesis story is that there's a tension there between the divine promise and the fulfillment of the promise. So Abraham journeys from, he doesn't actually start in Ur of the Chaldees, as is originally said, because his father took him up to Haran, which is in sort of Syria now. And so he starts from there. And it's presented as a vocation story, in a sense. But almost as soon as he arrives in Canaan, he has to go to Egypt because of famine. And then when he returns, he wanders about the land. So he's being presented as a kind of wandering person, kind of almost like a sort of semi-Bedouin. He's got lots of cattle and lots of sheep and lots of property and so on. So it's a big enterprise to get him there. So he's quite a big figure all the same. So he's got leadership quality, if you like. And at the end of the story, Abraham is back in the land, but the only thing he actually possesses in the land is a tomb which he buys for his wife and himself. And the book of Genesis ends with his descendants back in Egypt, where eventually they'll fall into slavery. Remember, this is the story of Joseph, right? And eventually in the Exodus book will begin a new session of the journey when Moses leads them back towards the land. So you have the model of Abraham again in the land is not of a real possession of the land. The only thing he possesses is his grave. So I wonder what we'd make of that. Now, this is not an exhaustive theology, a treatment of the theology of the land, but if nothing else, I hope that you've got a sense that the topic is a little bit more complex than many people think. And I must congratulate you on your poem, which made it all look so simple. And of course, that is the thing about faith in God, is that it is, as Basil Hume once said towards the end of his life, he said, when you get old, he says, things get a bit simpler. But he said, that's only because you've done the work beforehand and you've made your way through all the complexity and so on. So Jews, Christians and Muslims all can be recognized as stakeholders in the land, but my reading of the text suggests that no one social or political group can claim exclusive possession of the land on the basis of biblical authority. At the end of the day, the land is only the Holy Land if its people live in obedience to the will of God and see the land as gift, not entitlement, a place that is the exclusive property of no one, but a holy place for the nations to gather under God.